Behind the magnificent walls of China's Forbidden City lay a world of extraordinary complexity, where thousands of women lived lives far removed from the freedom most of us take for granted today. These were the imperial concubines, women whose stories have been whispered through the corridors of history, often misunderstood, frequently romanticized, but rarely told with the full weight of their human experience. Tonight, we journey into their world, not to sensationalize their struggles, but to understand the intricate web of tradition, power, and survival that defined their existence. The imperial concubine system in China spanned over 2 millennia, evolving through numerous dynasties, each adding its own layers of ritual and restriction. From the Han Dynasty through the final days of the Qing, millions of women found themselves bound by invisible chains of gold and silk, their lives dictated by ancient customs that prioritized the emperor's needs above all else. These women came from all walks of life, some from noble families seeking political alliance, others from humble backgrounds chosen for their beauty or talents, and many who had little choice in their destiny at all. To understand their world, we must first step through the imposing gates of the Forbidden City itself. Imagine, if you will, walking across those vast courtyards for the first time, the weight of centuries pressing down upon your shoulder. The architecture itself was designed to overwhelm, to remind every person within its walls of their place in the cosmic order. For a young woman entering as a concubine, these moments would have been filled with a mixture of terror and wonder, knowing that she might never see her family again, yet understanding that she was entering a world of unimaginable luxury and equally unimaginable constraint. The selection process for imperial concubines was itself a complex ritual that varied between dynasties but always emphasized the complete subjugation of personal choice to imperial will. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, officials would travel throughout the empire, seeking young women of appropriate age and beauty. Families sometimes volunteered their daughters, hoping for advancement and favor, while others found themselves with little choice when imperial decree demanded their compliance. The selection criteria were exacting. Not just physical beauty but also family background, education, and even astrological compatibility were considered in this most consequential of lotteries. Once selected, these young women would undergo months of preparation and training before entering the palace. They learned the intricate protocols of court life, the proper ways to walk, sit, speak, and even breathe in the presence of imperial authority. Every gesture was codified, every word measured, every emotion carefully controlled. This training was not mere etiquette, but a complete reconstruction of identity, transforming ordinary young women into vessels of imperial pleasure and political utility. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. It represented nothing less than the complete surrender of individual agency to the needs of the state. Within the palace walls, a complex hierarchy governed every aspect of concubine life. At the apex sat the empress, followed by various ranks of imperial consorts, each with specific titles, privileges, and responsibility. The system was designed to create competition among the women, ensuring that loyalty flowed upward to the emperor rather than horizontally among peers who might otherwise unite in common cause. A concubine's rank determined everything from the quality of her quarters to the number of servants she could command, from the jewels she could wear to the food she could eat. The lowest-ranking concubines lived in conditions that, while luxurious by common standards, were restrictive and closely monitored. They shared quarters with multiple other women, their days structured around rigid schedules of lessons, ceremonies, and the ever-present possibility of imperial summons. Privacy was virtually non-existent, with eunuchs and senior court ladies maintaining constant surveillance. Every conversation was potentially subject to scrutiny. Every friendship could be interpreted as conspiracy, and every moment of solitude was rare and precious. Higher-ranking concubines enjoyed greater privileges but faced proportionally greater pressures and danger. They occupied individual quarters, maintained their own small courts of servants, and had access to better food, clothing, and entertainment. However, their elevated status also meant they were more visible targets for palace intrigue. more subject to the jealousies of rivals, and more likely to be caught in the crossfire of political machinations that extended far beyond the palace wall. Success in the imperial harem was often measured not just by the emperor's favor, but by one's ability to navigate these treacherous social waters. The daily rhythm of concubine life was punctuated by rituals and ceremonies that reinforced their dependent status while providing structure to days that might otherwise stretch endlessly. Morning ablutions were elaborate affairs, with multiple servants attending to every detail of dress and appearance. The preparation was not vanity but necessity. To appear before imperial authority in anything less than perfect condition was to court disaster. Hair arrangements alone could take hours, with each ornament and decoration carrying specific meaning and significance within the complex symbolic language of court culture. Education formed a central part of concubine life, though it was education with a very specific purpose. These women learned poetry, music, painting, and calligraphy not for their own enrichment but to better serve as cultured companions to the emperor. They studied history and philosophy, but always through the lens of imperial ideology. They learned to play musical instruments and compose verses, skills that might win them fleeting moments of imperial attention. This education was both a privilege and a burden. It opened their minds to beauty and knowledge while simultaneously reminding them that all their accomplishments existed solely to please another. The question of romantic love within this system presents one of its most poignant contradictions. While popular literature and modern media often depict imperial concubines as competing for the emperor's love, the reality was far more complex and often heartbreaking. These women were expected to display appropriate affection and desire, but genuine emotional connection was both dangerous and largely impossible within such an artificial construct. Love, when it did develop, often became a source of vulnerability rather than strength, as emotional attachment could be weaponized by rivals or exploited by those seeking political advantage. Competition among concubines was both overt and subtle, manifesting in everything from elaborate displays of talent during imperial entertainments to careful maneuvering during court ceremony. The stakes of these competitions extended far beyond personal preference. They determined access to resources, influence over imperial decisions, and ultimately the ability to secure one's position and potentially that of one's family. Some women formed alliances, pooling their limited power to protect mutual interests, while others adopted strategies of isolation, believing that independence offered the best chance of survival. The role of eunuchs in concubine life cannot be understated, as these castrated men served as intermediaries, guards, and often confidants within the women's quarters. Eunuchs occupied a unique position in palace hierarchy, neither fully male nor female, neither fully powerful nor powerless. For concubines, relationships with eunuchs could provide crucial access to information, resources, and influence. Some eunuchs became genuine allies and friends, while others exploited their positions to manipulate and control the women under their supervision. These relationships were complex negotiations of trust and necessity within a system that offered few genuine friendships. Pregnancy represented both the ultimate success and greatest danger in a concubine's life. Bearing the emperor's child, particularly a male heir, could elevate a woman's status dramatically, providing security and influence that would last for the rest of her life. However, pregnancy also made concubines targets for those who saw new heirs as threats to their own positions or those of their children. The palace was filled with stories, both documented and whispered, of pregnancies that ended mysteriously, of newborns who died under suspicious circumstances, and of mothers who found themselves suddenly out of favor after producing the wrong gender of child. The medical care available to concubines reflected their paradoxical position within palace society. They had access to the finest physicians and the most exotic remedies available in the empire, yet their health was always secondary to their function. Treatments focused primarily on maintaining beauty and fertility, with less attention paid to overall well-being or personal comfort. Traditional Chinese medicine, with its emphasis on balance and harmony, was applied not to help these women achieve personal equilibrium, but to maintain their usefulness to the imperial system. Seasonal cycles provided some variety to the otherwise regimented life within the palace walls. Spring brought festivals and garden parties, opportunities for concubines to display their talents and potentially catch imperial attention. Summer meant longer days but also increased scrutiny, as outdoor activities made surveillance easier. Autumn festivals centered around poetry and moon viewing, competitions where educated concubines could demonstrate their cultural refinement. Winter was often the most difficult season, with shorter days and fewer distractions from the fundamental loneliness of their situation. The economics of concubine life reveal another layer of complexity in their existence. While they lived surrounded by luxury, concubines had very limited control over material resources. Their clothing, jewelry, furnishings, and even food were allocated according to rank and imperial favor, creating a system where material comfort was always conditional and could be withdrawn at any moment. Some concubines accumulated personal wealth through gifts and allowances, but these resources were always subject to confiscation and could never provide true security or independence. Religious and spiritual practices offered some concubines a refuge from the pressures of court life, though even their spiritual lives were subject to regulation and oversight. Buddhism and Taoism provided philosophical frameworks for understanding suffering and finding inner peace, concepts that were particularly relevant to women trapped in gilded cages. However, religious devotion could also be seen as a form of rebellion against the emperor's ultimate authority, making even spiritual solace a potentially dangerous pursuit. The art and literature produced by imperial concubines provide some of our most intimate glimpses into their emotional lives. Poetry, written by these women, often employs coded language and metaphor to express feelings that could not be stated directly. Paintings and calligraphy served similar purposes, allowing for emotional expression within acceptable cultural form. These artistic works reveal not just technical skill but profound longing, subtle rebellion, and remarkable resilience in the face of systematic oppression. Medical texts and palace records describe the various ailments that commonly affected concubines, many of which were clearly related to the stress and restrictions of their lifestyle. Depression, anxiety, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress were common, though these conditions were understood and treated very differently in historical Chinese medicine. Physical ailments often reflected the psychological toll of their situation. Digestive problems, headaches, and sleep disorders plagued many women who lived under constant pressure and uncertainty. The system of imperial concubinage was not static, but evolved significantly over the centuries, with different dynasties implementing variations that reflected changing political needs and cultural values. The Han dynasty established many of the basic structures, while the Tang dynasty saw perhaps the most liberal interpretation of concubine roles, allowing some women significant influence in court affairs. The Song dynasty introduced more restrictive elements, while the Ming and Qing dynasties created the most elaborate and oppressive versions of the system. Cultural attitudes toward imperial concubines varied greatly depending on one's position within society. Common people often viewed these women with a mixture of envy and pity, envying their material luxury, while recognizing the price paid for such privilege. Scholars and officials typically saw concubines as necessary components of imperial authority, important for producing heirs and maintaining the dignity of the throne. The women themselves had limited ability to express their own perspectives, leaving their true feelings largely unrecorded in official histories. The question of consent within the imperial concubine system reveals its most troubling aspects. While some women entered the palace willingly seeking advancement for themselves and their families, many had little real choice in the matter. Imperial selection often functioned as a form of conscription, with families unable to refuse without facing severe consequences. Even those who entered willingly quickly discovered that the reality of palace life bore little resemblance to the romantic fantasies they might have harbored. Training and indoctrination of new concubines was a lengthy process designed to break down existing identity and rebuild it according to palace requirements. Young women learned not just how to behave but how to think, feel, and dream within acceptable parameters. This psychological conditioning was perhaps the most effective means of control, creating internalized limitations that were more powerful than any external restraint. The process was so thorough that many concubines eventually believed they were fortunate to occupy their positions despite the obvious limitations on their freedom. The relationship between concubines and the broader palace staff created another complex web of dependencies and potential alliances. Servants, guards, officials, and other court personnel all had their own interests and agendas, which sometimes aligned with those of individual concubines but could just as easily conflict with them. Navigating these relationships required considerable skill and constant vigilance, as today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy based on shifting political winds or personal grievances. Seasonal celebrations and festivals provided some of the few opportunities for concubines to experience something approaching normalcy, though even these events were carefully choreographed and monitored. New Year festivities, moon festivals, and imperial birthdays allowed for music, dancing, and elaborate feasts, but always within the context of their restricted roles. These celebrations were simultaneously moments of joy and reminders of what they had sacrificed, offering glimpses of the broader world they could no longer fully participate in. The psychological impact of prolonged isolation and competition created lasting trauma that affected generations of women. Many concubines developed elaborate coping mechanisms, from creating secret friendships to developing private spiritual practices that help them maintain some sense of individual identity. Others succumbed to despair, becoming withdrawn and listless, living out their days as shadows of their former selves. The stronger personalities often channeled their intelligence and energy into subtle forms of resistance, finding ways to maintain dignity and agency within severely constrained circumstances. Documentation of concubine life comes primarily from official court records, which tend to focus on administrative details rather than personal experience. Palace regulations, gift lists, and ceremonial protocols provide insight into the formal structure of their lives, but reveal little about their emotional reality. Occasional glimpses emerge from poetry, private letters that somehow survived, and the memoirs of eunuchs or officials who observed palace life from different perspectives. These sources must be read carefully, as they often reflect the biases and limitations of their author. The impact of imperial concubinage extended beyond the palace walls, influencing broader cultural attitudes toward women, marriage, and family relationships throughout Chinese society. The emperor's household served as a model, albeit an extreme one, for patriarchal authority and female subordination. The elaborate rituals and hierarchies of the palace were reflected, in simplified form, in wealthy households throughout the empire, creating a cultural framework that normalized female subjugation and limited women's opportunities for independent action. Economic aspects of the concubine system reveal its function as a form of political currency, with women serving as symbols of imperial power and tools for diplomatic relationship. The cost of maintaining thousands of concubines, their servants, their quarters, and their elaborate lifestyles represented a significant drain on imperial resources. Yet this expense was considered necessary for maintaining imperial prestige and authority. The system also created employment for thousands of others, eunuchs, servants, guards, and craftspeople, who supplied the palace with its endless requirements for luxury goods. Health and mortality rates among imperial concubines reflected both their privileged access to medical care and the stressful conditions of their lives. While they lived longer than most women of their era and had access to the best available treatments for various ailments, they also suffered from high rates of mental health problems, complications related to frequent pregnancies, and mysterious deaths that suggest poisoning or other forms of violence. The palace medical records that survive provide fascinating insights into historical Chinese medicine, while also revealing the ways in which women's health was subordinated to their reproductive function. The role of literature and poetry in concubine life served multiple purposes, providing both entertainment and a means of subtle communication and resistance. Many concubines were highly educated and used their literary skills to create works that appeared to conform to palace expectations, while actually expressing forbidden thoughts and feelings. Reading between the lines of surviving poems reveals sophisticated critiques of their situation, expressions of longing for freedom, and remarkable insights into human nature under extreme pressure. International perspectives on Chinese imperial concubinage varied significantly, with foreign visitors often expressing shock at the scale and elaborateness of the system while sometimes misunderstanding its cultural context. European missionaries and diplomats left detailed accounts that provide valuable outside perspectives, though these must be read with awareness of their own cultural biases. These foreign observations help highlight aspects of the system that Chinese sources might take for granted, while also revealing the ways in which different cultures understood concepts of marriage, authority, and women's roles. The training regimens for imperial concubines were comprehensive programs designed to transform ordinary young women into perfect courtiers and potential imperial companions. These programs included not just etiquette and cultural education but also physical conditioning, voice training, and instruction in various forms of entertainment. The psychological aspects of this training were equally intensive, involving conditioning designed to create absolute loyalty and submission while maintaining the appearance of spontaneous affection and desire. Resistance and rebellion within the concubine system took many forms, from subtle acts of non-compliance to desperate attempts at escape. While organized rebellion was virtually impossible given the isolation and surveillance that characterized palace life, individual acts of resistance were common. These might include refusing to compete for imperial attention, forming forbidden friendships, practicing unauthorized religious observances, or finding ways to communicate with the outside world. Such acts required considerable courage, as the consequences for discovery were severe. The seasonal rhythm of palace life created different challenges and opportunities for concubines throughout the year. Spring brought new selections and the arrival of young women who disrupted existing hierarchies and relationships. Summer festivals provided opportunities for display and competition but also increased scrutiny from palace officials. Autumn was often marked by imperial hunting expeditions and changes in residence that could alter the balance of power among different factions. Winter's isolation intensified the psychological pressures of palace life, while also providing more opportunities for private conversations and relationship. Medical practices within the palace reflected broader Chinese approaches to health and wellness, but were adapted to serve the specific needs of the imperial household. Concubines received regular health examinations focused primarily on their reproductive capacity and physical attractiveness. Traditional remedies were used to maintain youthful appearance, regulate menstrual cycles, and treat the various ailments that resulted from stress and restricted lifestyle. Palace physicians were among the most skilled practitioners in the empire, yet their primary obligation was to the emperor's interests rather than their patients' well-being. The architecture and design of concubine quarters were carefully planned to reinforce social hierarchies while providing appropriate settings for imperial visits. Lower-ranking concubines shared dormitory-style accommodations that emphasized economy and surveillance, while higher-ranking women occupied increasingly elaborate private quarters that resembled miniature palaces. These physical spaces were designed to be beautiful but also to remind their occupants of their dependent status. Luxurious cages that provided comfort while preventing escape. Marriage and family relationships outside the palace became impossible for imperial concubines, creating a profound sense of loss that affected their entire lives. Many women entered the palace as teenagers, before they had opportunities to develop mature romantic relationships or start families of their own. The knowledge that they would never experience normal family life created a particular form of grief that was rarely acknowledged or addressed within palace culture. Some found ways to create surrogate family relationships with other concubines or servants, while others channeled their maternal instincts into caring for the emperor's children or supporting younger women entering the palace. The economic structure of the palace created complex webs of dependency and exchange that extended far beyond simple monetary transactions. Concubines accumulated wealth through imperial gifts, family support, and various forms of informal economic activity, but this wealth was always precarious and subject to confiscation. Some women became skilled at managing these limited resources to build networks of support and influence, while others found themselves increasingly dependent on the generosity of others. The palace economy operated according to its own rules, with status and favor often more valuable than actual currency. Religious and spiritual practices provided many concubines with frameworks for understanding and coping with their difficult circumstances. Buddhism's emphasis on suffering as a fundamental aspect of human existence offered some comfort, while Taoist concepts of harmony and balance provided strategies for navigating palace politics. However, even spiritual life was subject to regulation and oversight, with certain practices forbidden or discouraged depending on political circumstance. Some women found ways to maintain private spiritual lives that provided genuine solace, while others used religious observance as a form of subtle resistance to imperial authority. The legacy of imperial concubinage extended far beyond the palace walls and the dynasties that created it, influencing Chinese attitudes toward women and family relationships for centuries after the system's formal abolition. The elaborate rituals and hierarchies developed within palace walls were adapted for use in wealthy households throughout the empire, creating cultural patterns that reinforced male authority and female subordination. Understanding this historical system helps illuminate the deep cultural roots of gender inequality, while also highlighting the remarkable resilience and creativity of women who found ways to maintain dignity and agency within severely constrained circumstances. Cultural representations of imperial concubines in literature, art, and popular culture have often romanticized their experiences while obscuring the harsh realities of their daily lives. These romanticized portrayals serve various purposes, from entertainment to political propaganda, but they often do a disservice to the real women who lived within the system. Modern scholarship increasingly seeks to recover the authentic voices and experiences of these women, using careful analysis of surviving documents and artifacts to paint a more accurate picture of their complex and often tragic lives. The international context of imperial concubinage reveals similar systems in other cultures and time periods, suggesting that the concentration of women around powerful men has been a recurring pattern in human society. Comparing the Chinese system to harems in the Ottoman Empire, the wives of European monarchs, or the concubines of various African kingdoms reveals both common elements and unique features. These comparisons help us understand imperial concubinage, not as an isolated historical curiosity, but as part of broader patterns of power, sexuality, and social organization. Training in various arts and cultural pursuits was central to concubine education, but this training served specific purposes related to imperial entertainment and prestige, rather than personal development. Music lessons focused on pieces that would please imperial audiences. Poetry instruction emphasized themes and styles that aligned with court preferences, and painting lessons concentrated on subjects that would appropriately decorate palace spaces. While this education provided intellectual stimulation and creative outlets, it was always bounded by the needs and preferences of imperial authority. The question of historical accuracy in our understanding of imperial concubine life remains challenging, given the limited and often biased nature of surviving sources. Official court records provide administrative details but little insight into personal experiences, while literary sources may reflect idealized or sensationalized versions of palace life, rather than realistic portrayals. Archaeological evidence from palace sites offers some insights into living conditions and daily routines, but these material remains cannot capture the emotional and psychological dimensions of concubine experience. Power dynamics within the concubine system were extraordinarily complex, with multiple hierarchies and competing interests creating a constantly shifting landscape of alliances and conflicts. Individual concubines had to navigate relationships with the emperor, other concubines, palace officials, servants, and their own families, each relationship governed by different rules and expectations. Success required not just beauty and charm, but also political acumen, emotional intelligence, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The abolition of imperial concubinage came gradually rather than through a single decisive act, as changing political circumstances and foreign pressure slowly undermined the traditional justifications for the system. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912 marked the formal end of imperial concubinage, but cultural attitudes and practices, influenced by centuries of imperial tradition, persisted for decades afterward. Understanding this transition helps illuminate the complex relationship between political change and cultural transformation in modern Chinese history. Seasonal festivals and celebrations within the palace provided some of the few opportunities for concubines to experience collective joy and temporary freedom from their usual restrictions. However, even these celebrations were carefully orchestrated to serve imperial purposes, with spontaneous enjoyment rare and potentially dangerous. The contrast between the elaborate festivities and the underlying sadness of many participants created a poignant atmosphere that was noted by some contemporary observers. Medical knowledge in practice within imperial palaces represented the pinnacle of traditional Chinese medicine, yet this advanced care was always subordinated to political needs and imperial preferences. Palace physicians were skilled practitioners who had access to rare medicines and sophisticated diagnostic techniques, but their primary obligation was to maintain the health and beauty of concubines in service to imperial pleasure, rather than to promote the well-being of their patients as individuals. The psychological toll of life within the imperial concubine system manifested in various ways, from depression and anxiety to more severe forms of mental illness. The constant pressure to please, the isolation from normal human relationships, and the uncertainty about the future created conditions that would challenge anyone's mental health. Some women developed remarkable resilience and found ways to create meaning within their constrained circumstances, while others succumbed to despair and lived out their days as shadows of their former selves. Documentation of daily life within the palace provides glimpses into routines that were simultaneously luxurious and oppressive. Morning preparations involved elaborate rituals of bathing, dressing, and cosmetic application that could take hours to complete. Meals were formal affairs governed by strict protocols about seating arrangements, conversation topics, and proper behavior. Educational activities, artistic pursuits, and religious observances filled the remaining hours, always under the watchful eyes of supervisors who reported on every detail to higher authority. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden world of imperial concubines, we are left with a complex legacy that resists simple interpretation. These women lived lives of extraordinary privilege and devastating limitation, surrounded by beauty yet trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Their stories remind us of the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience, of the ways in which social systems can simultaneously elevate and destroy, and of the importance of remembering those whose voices have been silenced by history. In understanding their experiences, we gain insight not only into a fascinating chapter of Chinese history, but also into the enduring questions of power, freedom, and human dignity that continue to shape our world today. Their legacy lives on, not in the golden halls where they once walked, but in our growing understanding of the complex forces that shape human societies, and in our commitment to creating a world where such systematic oppression can never again flourish unchallenged. The transformation of young women into imperial concubines began long before they entered the Forbidden City's gates. Families throughout the empire would receive visits from imperial scouts, men whose trained eyes could assess not just physical beauty but also the subtle indicators of good breeding, intelligence, and temperament that made a woman suitable for palace life. These scouts looked for specific qualities: a graceful walk that suggested natural elegance, hands that showed they had been cared for but also capable of delicate work, and most importantly, a demeanor that balanced modesty with the kind of presence that could command attention in a crowded room. The farewell ceremonies when selected girls left their families were heart-wrenching affairs that reveal the human cost of imperial glory. Mothers would spend their daughters' last nights at home teaching them final lessons about survival, whispered wisdom about reading people's intentions and protecting themselves in a world where trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. Fathers, often proud of their daughter's selection but grieving their loss, would offer stern advice about honor and duty while struggling to contain their own emotions. Siblings would make desperate promises to remember their sister exactly as she was, knowing that the woman who might return years later would be fundamentally changed by her experiences. Transportation to the capital was itself a ritual of transformation, with selected women traveling in covered carriages that gradually separated them from the familiar landscapes of their childhood. The journey could take weeks or even months, during which the women would receive preliminary instruction in palace protocol from the eunuchs and court ladies who accompanied them. This travel period served as a psychological buffer, allowing the women to gradually adjust to their new reality while still maintaining some connection to their former lives through the changing scenery outside their carriage window. Arrival at the Forbidden City was designed to overwhelm and intimidate, ensuring that new concubines understood their insignificance within the vast machinery of imperial power. The sheer scale of the architecture, walls that seemed to stretch forever, courtyards that could hold thousands of people, Buildings whose roof lines disappeared into the sky created an immediate sense of disorientation and awe. Guards in elaborate uniforms, officials in silk robes, and servants scurrying about their duties created a human landscape as foreign and intimidating as the physical structures surrounding the new arrival. The initial medical examinations that all new concubines underwent were thorough to the point of humiliation, designed not just to assess health but to establish the complete lack of privacy that would characterize their future lives. Palace physicians, assisted by experienced court ladies, would examine every inch of their bodies, noting any scars, birthmarks, or other distinguishing features that would become part of their permanent palace record. These examinations also included assessments of reproductive potential, with particular attention paid to signs that suggested fertility and the ability to bear healthy children. Assignment to living quarters represented the first concrete manifestation of the hierarchy that would govern every aspect of concubine life. The most beautiful or best-connected new arrivals might be assigned to individual rooms in prestigious sections of the palace, while others found themselves sharing cramped quarters with multiple roommates in less desirable locations. These initial assignments were not permanent, but served as starting points for the complex competition that would determine each woman's ultimate fate within the palace system. The first meals served to new concubines were elaborate affairs designed to demonstrate both the luxury they would enjoy and the strict protocols they must follow. Every dish was precisely arranged, every utensil had its proper place and purpose, and every bite was taken according to established rules about timing, posture, and appropriate expressions of appreciation. Violation of dining protocol was not just poor manners but a form of rebellion against imperial authority that could result in punishment or demotion within the palace hierarchy. Language training became crucial for concubines who arrived from distant provinces speaking regional dialects or minority languages. The imperial court operated in refined Mandarin with specific vocabulary and speech patterns that marked speakers as educated and cultured. Women who could not master these linguistic requirements found themselves at severe disadvantages, unable to participate fully in court conversations or to express themselves in ways that would attract positive imperial attention. Some women never fully overcame these linguistic barriers, remaining forever marked as outsiders within the palace community. The psychological process of identity reconstruction was perhaps the most challenging aspect of early palace life. New concubines had to learn not just how to behave differently but how to think of themselves as fundamentally different people. Their former names were often replaced with palace names that reflected their new status and function. Their personal histories were gradually suppressed in favor of carefully constructed palace identities that emphasized their dedication to imperial service above all other loyalties or relationships. Friendships among new concubines developed quickly but were always complicated by the competitive nature of palace life. Women who arrived together often formed initial bonds based on shared experiences of displacement and fear. But these relationships were tested as soon as imperial attention began to be distributed unequally among them. Some friendships survived these pressures and became sources of mutual support and protection, while others dissolved into jealousy and rivalry that could last for decades. The role of senior concubines in training newcomers created complex mentorship relationships that could be both nurturing and exploitative. Established palace women understood that helping newcomers could create useful alliances, but they also recognized that too much assistance might create competitors for imperial attention. The most skilled senior concubines learned to provide just enough guidance to create gratitude and loyalty without fostering independence or confidence that might threaten their own positions. Cultural education continued throughout a concubine's palace career, but was most intensive during her first years. Beyond basic literacy and numeracy, this education included instruction in classical poetry, historical precedents for proper behavior, philosophical principles that justified the imperial system, and artistic techniques that could be used to create pleasing entertainment for imperial audiences. The goal was not to create independent thinkers, but to produce cultured companions who could enhance the emperor's reputation and pleasure through their refined accomplishments. Physical conditioning was another aspect of concubine training that is often overlooked in popular account. Palace life required specific physical capabilities, the ability to kneel gracefully for extended periods, to walk with appropriate dignity while wearing elaborate costumes, to maintain perfect posture during long ceremonies, and to perform various forms of dance and physical entertainment. Women who arrived from rural backgrounds often struggled with these requirements, while those from wealthy urban families typically adapted more easily to the physical demands of court life. The seasonal wardrobe changes that governed concubine dress were elaborate productions that revealed the intersection of aesthetic beauty and social control. Each season brought new colors, fabrics, and ornamental styles that were strictly regulated according to rank and imperial favor. A concubine's clothing was not just personal adornment, but a public declaration of her status within the palace hierarchy. Changes in clothing assignments could signal shifts in imperial opinion or alterations in the balance of power among different court factions. Cosmetic practices within the palace were highly developed arts that served both aesthetic and symbolic purposes. The application of makeup, the arrangement of hair ornaments, and the selection of fragrances were all governed by complex rules that varied according to season, occasion, and individual rank. These practices required considerable skill and time, with many concubines spending several hours each day on cosmetic preparation. The results were intended not just to enhance beauty, but to communicate specific messages about the wearer's status, availability, and dedication to imperial pleasure. The palace library system provided concubines with access to thousands of books and scrolls, but this access was carefully regulated to ensure that their reading supported rather than challenged imperial authority. Certain texts were forbidden entirely, while others were available only to concubines of specific ranks or those who had demonstrated particular loyalty. The library served as both an educational resource and a form of subtle control, shaping the intellectual development of palace women while limiting their exposure to potentially dangerous ideas. Musical training within the palace emphasized instruments and compositions that were particularly favored by imperial audiences. Concubines learned to play the guqin, pipa, and various flutes, but their repertoire was limited to pieces that conveyed appropriate themes and emotion. Original composition was sometimes encouraged, but only within strict guidelines that ensured the results would enhance rather than challenge imperial authority. Musical performances were regular features of palace life, providing entertainment for the emperor while allowing concubines to demonstrate their cultural refinement and compete for attention. The gardening activities that occupied many concubines during daylight hours were both practical pursuits and forms of meditation that helped women cope with the stresses of palace life. Palace gardens were elaborate landscapes that required constant maintenance and seasonal replant. Concubines of various ranks participated in this work, according to carefully established protocols, with higher-ranking women directing activities while lower-ranking women performed more manual labor. These outdoor activities provided some of the few opportunities for physical exercise and fresh air that palace life afforded. Letter writing became a crucial skill for concubines who sought to maintain connections with their families or to communicate with other palace residents. However, all correspondence was subject to censorship and surveillance, with palace officials reading every letter before it was sent or delivered. Concubines learned to develop coded languages and subtle references that could convey personal messages while avoiding detection by censors. Some women became extraordinarily skilled at this form of covert communication, creating elaborate systems of hidden meaning within apparently innocuous correspondence. The celebration of personal birthdays within the palace created opportunities for individual recognition while reinforcing the communal nature of concubine life. These celebrations were modest affairs compared to imperial birthdays, but still involved special foods, small gifts, and temporary relaxation of normal protocol. Birthday celebrations also served as occasions for reflection on the passage of time and the gradual acceptance of permanent separation from former lives and relationships. Religious observances within the palace were complex affairs that had to balance genuine spiritual needs with political requirements and imperial preferences. Buddhist and Taoist ceremonies were regular features of palace life, but the specific forms these observances took were carefully controlled to ensure they supported rather than competed with imperial authority. Some concubines found genuine spiritual comfort in these practices, while others participated primarily as social obligations that helped maintain their standing within the palace community. The medical care provided to concubines reflected both advanced Chinese medical knowledge and the specific needs of palace life. Regular health examinations focused on maintaining beauty and fertility, but palace physicians also treated the various ailments that resulted from stress, limited physical activity, and the psychological pressures of court life. Traditional remedies were supplemented by more exotic treatments and medicines that were available only within palace walls, creating a standard of medical care that was superior to what most people of the era could access. Punishment within the concubine system was designed to maintain order while preserving the illusion of imperial benevolence. Physical punishment was relatively rare, as it could damage the beauty that was central to concubine function. But social punishments were common and could be devastating. Loss of rank, restriction to quarters, reduction of servants or privileges, and exclusion from palace activities were all used to maintain discipline and discourage behavior that challenged established hierarchies or protocol. The role of fortune tellers and astrologers within palace life reflected broader Chinese cultural beliefs while serving specific functions within the concubine system. These specialists were consulted about auspicious dates for various activities, the compatibility of different individuals, and the likely outcomes of various courses of action. Their pronouncements could significantly influence palace politics and individual fortunes, making them important figures whose favor was cultivated by concubines seeking advantage or guidance. Artistic collaborations between concubines created some of the most beautiful and poignant works produced within palace walls. Groups of women would work together on elaborate embroideries, collaborative poems, or complex musical compositions that showcased their individual talents while demonstrating their ability to work harmoniously together. These collaborative works often expressed themes and emotions that individual artists might not have dared to explore alone, using the collective effort to provide some protection from potential criticism or punishment. The training of younger concubines by their more experienced colleagues created informal educational systems that supplemented official palace instruction. Senior women would pass along practical knowledge about navigating palace politics, managing relationships with eunuchs and officials, and surviving the various challenges of court life. This knowledge was often more valuable than formal education, as it was based on real experience and addressed practical problems that new concubines would inevitably face. Seasonal migrations within the palace complex provided some variety to otherwise routine lives, while reinforcing the importance of imperial preference and authority. Summer retreats to cooler palace sections, autumn moves to quarters with better views of seasonal foliage, and winter relocations to warmer buildings were all orchestrated according to rank and favor. These moves required elaborate preparations and created temporary disruptions that could alter social dynamics and provide opportunities for changes in status or relationship. The palace economy created numerous opportunities for concubines to acquire personal possessions and accumulate modest wealth, though all such activities were subject to regulation and oversight. Skilled needlework, calligraphy, and other crafts could be sold or traded for luxury items, personal services, or small privileges that made daily life more bearable. Some concubines became quite entrepreneurial within the constraints of palace life, developing networks of exchange and mutual support that operated parallel to official palace systems. Food preparation and consumption within the concubine quarters followed elaborate protocols that reflected both nutritional science and social hierarchy. Meals were planned according to traditional Chinese medical principles that emphasized balance and seasonal appropriateness. But the quality and variety of food available to individual concubines depended heavily on their rank and current level of imperial favor. Special dietary requirements, whether for health reasons or personal preference, had to be negotiated through complex bureaucratic processes that could take months to resolve. The maintenance of palace quarters required constant attention and provided another form of structured activity that filled the long days of concubine life. Each woman was responsible for maintaining her living space according to strict standards of cleanliness and organization, while higher-ranking concubines supervised the upkeep of common areas and ceremonial spaces. These maintenance activities were not merely practical necessities but forms of meditation and discipline that helped maintain psychological stability within the artificial environment of palace life. Communication between different sections of the palace complex required elaborate systems of messengers and coded signals that allowed information to flow while maintaining security and protocol. Concubines learned to navigate these communication networks to maintain relationships, gather information about court politics, and coordinate activities with women in other parts of the palace. The most skilled communicators could influence events far beyond their immediate environment by effectively using these information networks. The treatment of illness within the concubine quarters reflected both advanced medical knowledge and the social realities of palace life. Serious illnesses that might affect a concubine's appearance or availability received immediate attention from the finest physicians, while minor complaints were often treated by older concubines who had accumulated practical medical knowledge over their years in palace. Mental health issues were less well understood, but were sometimes treated through changes in environment, assignment of companions, or permission to engage in favorite activities. Personal possessions became tremendously important to concubines as symbols of identity and connection to their former lives. A piece of jewelry from home, a favorite book, or a small ornament could take on enormous emotional significance in an environment where individual expression was severely limited. The acquisition, protection, and display of personal possessions became complex negotiations that involved palace authorities, fellow concubines, and the various servants and officials who controlled access to resources. The training in various forms of entertainment and performance was designed to create a pool of talented women who could enhance imperial ceremonies and private gatherings. Dance, music, poetry, recitation, and storytelling were all emphasized. But the specific forms these arts took were carefully controlled to ensure appropriate content and style. Original creative work was sometimes encouraged, but only within strict boundaries that ensured the results would please imperial audiences while reinforcing established cultural values and political messages. Evening routines within the concubine quarters followed patterns that had been established over centuries, creating rhythms of activity that provided structure, while reinforcing the artificial nature of palace life. As daylight faded behind the high walls of the Forbidden City, oil lamps and candles would be lit throughout the women's quarters, casting dancing shadows that seemed to emphasize the dreamlike quality of their existence. The transition from day to night brought both relief from the pressures of potential imperial attention and increased anxiety about the possibility of midnight summons that could change a woman's fate forever. The elaborate systems of palace surveillance extended into every corner of concubine life, creating an atmosphere of constant observation that profoundly affected behavior and relationships. Eunuchs stationed throughout the women's quarters reported on conversations, activities, and associations, while senior court ladies maintained detailed records of each concubine's daily routine, emotional state, and level of compliance with palace protocol. This surveillance was not hidden but deliberately obvious, serving as a constant reminder that privacy was a luxury that no longer existed for these women. Pregnancy announcements within the palace created immediate upheavals in established hierarchies and relationships, as the possibility of producing an imperial heir transformed a concubine's status overnight. The complex protocols surrounding pregnant concubines included enhanced medical care, improved living quarters, specialized diets, and increased security, but also intensified scrutiny and potential danger from those who saw new heirs as threats to their own position. The psychological pressure on pregnant concubines was enormous, as they understood that their own future and that of their unborn children depended on successfully navigating the treacherous waters of palace politics. Childbirth within the imperial palace was surrounded by elaborate ceremonies and superstitions designed to ensure the health of both mother and child, while reinforcing the cosmic significance of imperial offspring. The finest physicians and midwives attended these births, using techniques and medicines that represented the pinnacle of traditional Chinese medical knowledge. However, the immediate separation of newborn children from their mothers, a standard practice, designed to prevent the development of maternal bonds that might compete with imperial authority, created profound psychological trauma that affected women for the rest of their lives. The education of imperial children created another complex layer of relationships and responsibilities within the concubine system. Mothers were allowed limited contact with their offspring, while wet nurses, tutors, and palace officials assumed primary responsibility for child rearing. This system was designed to ensure that imperial children developed loyalty to the throne rather than personal attachment to their mothers, but it also created heartbreaking situations where women could watch their children grow up as strangers, knowing them only through formal ceremonies and brief, supervised visits. Death within the palace walls, whether from natural causes, political intrigue, or suicide, was handled according to elaborate protocols that emphasized the continuation of imperial authority over individual tragedy. The bodies of deceased concubines were typically buried in unmarked graves outside the palace complex, their names removed from official records as if they had never existed. This systematic erasure of individual identity extended even beyond death, ensuring that the imperial system remained more important than any of the people who served it. The role of superstition and folk belief in palace life provided some comfort and explanation for events that were otherwise incomprehensible or uncontrollable. Concubines developed elaborate systems of lucky and unlucky days, protective amulets and rituals, and interpretations of natural phenomena that helped them feel they had some influence over their fate. These beliefs were often borrowed from their home regions and adapted to palace circumstances, creating hybrid spiritual practices that reflected both their origins and their current circumstances. Palace libraries contained thousands of volumes, but access to these literary treasures was carefully regulated according to rank and imperial preference. Higher-ranking concubines might be allowed to read classical poetry and philosophical texts, while lower-ranking women were restricted to more basic educational materials. The selection of reading materials was not random, but reflected deliberate choices about what kinds of knowledge would be beneficial or dangerous for women in their position. Some concubines became extraordinarily well-read within these constraints, developing sophisticated understanding of Chinese culture and history. The seasonal festivals that punctuated palace life provided some of the few opportunities for concubines to experience collective joy, though even these celebrations were carefully orchestrated to serve imperial purposes. New Year festivities, mid-autumn celebrations, and various religious observances allowed for special foods, entertainment, and temporary relaxation of normal protocols. These events were simultaneously moments of genuine happiness and reminders of the broader world from which the concubines were forever separated. Artistic collaborations between concubines produced some of the most beautiful and emotionally resonant works created within palace walls. Group embroidery projects, collaborative musical compositions, and shared poetry writing allowed women to express feelings and ideas that would have been too dangerous to explore individually. These collaborative efforts also created bonds of friendship and mutual support that helped women survive the psychological challenges of their isolated existence. The complex relationships between concubines and palace servants created additional layers of dependency and potential alliance within the highly stratified world of imperial court life. Servants often came from similar backgrounds to the concubines they served, and sometimes developed genuine friendships with their mistresses, though such relationships were complicated by differences in status and the constant possibility of betrayal. The most successful concubines learned to treat their servants with appropriate kindness while maintaining necessary emotional distance. Medical examinations of concubines were regular occurrences that served multiple purposes beyond simple health assessment. These examinations monitored fertility, tracked the effects of palace life on physical and mental health, and provided opportunities for palace officials to gather information about the women under their supervision. The invasive nature of these examinations was another form of control, reminding concubines that their bodies belonged to the imperial system rather than to themselves. The palace workshop system allowed some concubines to develop specialized skills in crafts such as embroidery, jewelry making, perfume blending, and other luxury arts. These workshops provided intellectual stimulation and the satisfaction of creating beautiful objects. But the products of concubine labor always belonged to the palace rather than to their creator. Some women found genuine fulfillment in mastering these crafts, while others saw them as simply another form of elaborate imprisonment. Time measurement within the palace followed ancient patterns that emphasized the cyclical nature of imperial authority and the subordinate position of individual lives within these grand cosmic rhythms. Days were structured around imperial schedules and needs, with concubine activities coordinated to ensure availability whenever the emperor might desire entertainment or companionship. This systematic subordination of personal time to imperial requirements was another subtle but powerful form of control that shaped every aspect of palace life. Weather and seasonal changes affected palace life in ways that were both practical and symbolic. As the artificial environment of the Forbidden City remained connected to natural cycles despite its isolation from the outside world. Summer heat made the elaborate costumes and lengthy ceremonies of palace life particularly uncomfortable, while winter cold required complex systems of heating that were distributed according to rank and favor. Spring and autumn brought their own challenges and opportunities, with changing seasons serving as metaphors for the unpredictable shifts in fortune that characterized concubine life. The training of new eunuchs who would work within the women's quarters required careful attention to the specific challenges and opportunities of managing concubine population. These men had to learn not just administrative procedures, but also psychological techniques for maintaining order among women who were often intelligent, desperate, and highly motivated to improve their circumstance. The relationship between eunuchs and concubines was complex and often fraught with tension, as both groups occupied subordinate positions within the palace hierarchy while exercising different forms of limited power. Palace architecture was designed not just for beauty and functionality but also as a form of psychological control that reinforced the hierarchical nature of imperial society. The progression from outer courtyards to inner sanctuary, the increasing elaborateness of decoration in areas closer to imperial presence, and the careful regulation of who could access which spaces all served to remind concubines of their position within a vast and complex system that existed primarily to serve imperial needs and preference. The role of music in daily palace life extended far beyond entertainment to encompass communication, emotional expression, and subtle forms of resistance. Concubines learned to use musical performances to convey messages that could not be spoken directly, to express emotions that were otherwise forbidden, and to create moments of beauty and transcendence within lives that were often characterized by limitation and fear. The most skilled musicians became artists of extraordinary subtlety, capable of creating complex emotional experiences within the constraints of imperial protocol. Food preparation within the concubine quarters involved elaborate rituals and protocols that reflected both nutritional science and social hierarchy. Special diets were prescribed for different ranks of concubines, with higher status women receiving more exotic and expensive ingredients, while lower-ranking women subsisted on simpler fare. The preparation and serving of meals became opportunities for demonstrating cultural knowledge, artistic skill, and appropriate reverence for imperial authority. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation from normal human relationships manifested in various ways among palace concubines, from the development of intense friendships that substituted for family bonds, to the creation of elaborate fantasy lives that provided escape from harsh reality. Some women adapted remarkably well to their circumstances, finding ways to create meaning and satisfaction within severe constraints, while others struggled with depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges that were poorly understood and inadequately treated. Palace gardens provided some of the few spaces where concubines could experience something approaching natural beauty and seasonal change, though even these outdoor areas were carefully designed and maintained according to imperial preference. The cultivation of flowers, herbs, and ornamental plants became both a practical necessity and a form of meditation that helped women maintain psychological equilibrium. Gardening activities also provided opportunities for quiet conversation and relationship building away from the intense surveillance of indoor palace life. The complex systems of gift-giving within the palace created opportunities for building alliances and expressing emotions, while also serving as forms of subtle communication and political maneuver. Concubines learned to navigate the elaborate protocols surrounding the exchange of presents, understanding which gifts were appropriate for different occasions and relationships. The ability to give and receive gifts gracefully became an important social skill that could significantly impact a woman's standing within the palace community. Late-night conversations among concubines, conducted in whispers and coded language to avoid detection by surveillance systems, became crucial opportunities for emotional support, information sharing, and the maintenance of human connections that help women survive the psychological challenges of palace life. These clandestine communications required considerable skill and courage, as discovery could result in severe punishment, but they provided essential outlets for feelings and thoughts that could not be expressed through official channels. The celebration of imperial birthdays and other state occasions required elaborate preparations that involved all levels of palace society, from the highest-ranking consorts to the most junior servant. Concubines participated in these celebrations through performances, gift presentations, and ceremonial activities that demonstrated their loyalty and cultural refinement, while reinforcing their subordinate status within the imperial hierarchy. These occasions were simultaneously opportunities for recognition and reminders of the vast gulf that separated palace women from genuine political power or personal freedom. As the final rays of sunlight fade behind the towering walls of the Forbidden City, we conclude our journey through the hidden world of imperial concubines with a profound appreciation for the complexity and tragedy of their experience. These women, caught between worlds of unimaginable luxury and devastating limitation, remind us that human dignity and resilience can persist even under the most oppressive circumstances. Their stories, preserved in fragmentary records and whispered memories, continue to resonate across the centuries, offering insights into the nature of power, the cost of privilege, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. In remembering their lives, we honor not only their individual struggles and achievements, but also our collective responsibility to create societies where such systematic oppression can never again flourish unchallenged.